Hey, this evening I'm going to be reading from Saul Kripke's Naming and Necessity, which is a book from a series of lectures he gave in 1970. And this book marks a decisive shift in analytic philosophy's treatment of meaning, reference, and modality, where much of the Frege Russell tradition, together with logical positivism and its aftermath, sought to explain reference in terms of description, senses, verification conditions, or linguistic practices. Kripke argues that this approach gets the explanatory emphasis wrong. For him, names and natural kind terms do not refer by fitting descriptions associated with them by speakers. Rather, they refer directly to objects and kinds in the world, even where speakers are mistaken about many of the properties they associate with them. At the same time, he challenges the assumption, shared in many ways by Eyre and even Quine, that necessity is fundamentally a matter of language, convention, or analyticity, by arguing that some necessary truths are known only a posteriori. Kripke shifts the discussion of modality away from linguistic analysis and toward the culture of reality itself. The result is not just a new way of perceiving naming, but also a change in where the philosophical weight lies. In other words, reference and necessity are no longer explained primarily by facts about language, but by how language remains connected to the world it is used to describe. So I'll get started. I'll read from lecture one, which was given on January 20th, 1970. I hope that some people see some connection. I hope that some people see some connection between the two topics in the title. If not, anyway, such connections will be developed in the course of these talks. Furthermore, because of the use of tools involving reference and necessity in analytic philosophy today, our views on these topics really have wide ranging implications for other problems in philosophy that traditionally might be thought far removed, like arguments over the mind body problem or the so called identity thesis. Materialism in this form often now gets involved in very intricate ways in questions about what is necessary or contingent in the identity of properties, questions like that. So it is really very important to philosophers who may want to work in many domains to get clear about these concepts. Maybe I will say something about the mind body problem in the course of these talks. I want to talk also at some point, I don't know if I can get it in, about substances and natural kinds. The way I approach these matters will be in some ways quite different from what people are thinking today. It also has some points of contact with what some people have been thinking and writing today. If I leave people out in informal talks like this, I hope I'll be forgiven. Some of the views that I have are views which may at first glance strike some as obviously wrong. My favorite example is this, which I probably won't defend in these lectures. For one thing, it doesn't ever convince anyone. It is a common claim in contemporary philosophy that there are certain predicates which, though they are in fact empty, have null extension, have it as a matter of contingent fact and not as a matter of any sort of necessity. Well, that I don't dispute, but an example which is usually given in the form of unicorn. So it is said that though we have all found out that there are no unicorns, of course, there might have been unicorns. Under certain circumstances, there would have been unicorns. And this is an example of something I think is not the case. Perhaps according to me, the truth should not be put in terms of saying that it is necessary that there should be no unicorns, just that we can't say under what circumstances there would have been unicorns. Further, I think that even if archaeologists or geologists were to discover tomorrow some fossils conclusively showing the existence of animals in the past, satisfying everything we know today about unicorns from the myth of the unicorn, that would not show that there were unicorns. Now, I don't know if I'm going to have a chance to defend this particular view, but it's an example of a surprising one. I actually gave a seminar in this institution where I talked about this view for a couple of sessions. So, Some of my opinions are somewhat surprising. I think I should share this. But let us start out with some area that is perhaps not as surprising and introduce the methodology and problems of these talks. The first topic in the pair of topics is naming. By a name here, I mean a proper name, that is, the name of a person, a city, a country, and so on. Okay. And so on. It is well known that modern logicians are also very interested in definite descriptions. Phrases of the form the x such that x has phi, such as the man who corrupted Heidelberg now, if one and only one man ever corrupted Hedleyberg, then that man is the referent in the logician's sense of that description. We will use the term name so that it does not include definite descriptions of that sort, but only those things which in ordinary language would be called proper names. If we want a common term to cover names and descriptions, we may use the word designator. It is a point made by Donnellan that under certain circumstances, a particular speaker may use a definite description to refer not to a proper referent in the sense that I've just defined it, of that description, to something else which he wants to single out and which he thinks is the proper referent of the description, which in fact isn't. So you may say, the man over there with the champagne in his glass is happy, though he has water in his glass. Now, even though there is no champagne in his glass, and there may be another man in the room who does have champagne in his glass, the speaker intended to did refer to the man he thought had the champagne in his glass. Nevertheless, I'm just going to use the term referent of the description to mean footnotes in the object uniquely satisfying the conditions in the definite description. This is the sense in which it's been used in the local tradition. So if you have a description of the form x such that x has phi properties, and there is exactly one x such that x has phi properties, that is the referent of the description. Now, what is the relation between names and descriptions? There is a well-known doctrine of John Stuart Mill in his book, A System of Logic, that names have denotation, but not connotation. To use one of his examples, when we use the name Dartmouth to describe a certain locality in England, it may be so called because it lies in the mouth of the Dart. But even he says that the Dart, that's a river, changed its course so that Dartmouth no longer lay at the mouth of the Dart. We could still, with propriety, call this place Dartmouth, even though the name may suggest that it lies at the mouth of the Dart. Changing Mill's terminology, perhaps to say that a name such as Dartmouth does have a connotation to some people, namely, it does connote, not to me, I never thought of this, that any place Dartmouth lies at the mouth of a dart. But when in some way it doesn't have a sense, at least it is not part of the meaning of the name Dartmouth, that the town so named lies at the mouth of the Dart. Someone who said that Dartmouth did not lie at the Dart's mouth would not contradict himself. It would not be thought that the phrase of the form the X such that X has F properties is always used in English as a description rather than a name. I guess everyone has heard about the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither Holy Roman nor an empire. Today we have the United Nations. Here it would seem that since these things can be so called, even though they are not Holy Roman United Nations, these phrases should be regarded not as definite descriptions but as names. In the case of some terms, people might have doubts as to whether they're names or descriptions, like God. Does it describe God as the unique divine being, or is it a name of God? Such cases needn't necessarily bother us. Now, here, I'm making a distinction which is certainly made in language, but the classical tradition of modern logic has gone very strongly against Mill's view. Frege and Russell both thought, and seemed to arrive at these conclusions independently of each other, that Mill was wrong in a very strong sense. Really, a proper name, properly used, simply was a definite description abbreviated or disguised. Frege specifically said that such a description gave the sense of the name. Now, the reason against Mill's view, and in favor of the alternative view adopted by Frege and Russell, are really very powerful, and it is hard to see, though one may be suspicious of this view because names don't seem to be disguised descriptions, how the Frege-Russell view, some variant, can fail to be the case. Let me give an example of some of the arguments which seem conclusive in favor of the view of Frege and Russell. The basic problem for any view such as Mill's is how we can determine what the referent of a name as used by a given speaker is. According to the description view, the answer is clear. If Joe Doakes is just short for the man who corrupted Hedleyburg, then whoever captured Hedleyburg uniquely is the referent of the name Joe Doakes. However, if there is not such a descriptive content to the name, then how do people ever use names to refer to things at all? Well, they may be in a position to point to some things and thus determine the references of certain. This was Russell's doctrine of acquaintance, which he thought the so-called genuine or proper names satisfied. But of course, ordinary names refer to all sorts of people like Walter Scott, to whom we can't possibly point. And our reference here seems to be determined by our knowledge of them. Whatever we know about them determines the referent of the name as the unique thing satisfying those properties. For example, if I use the name Napoleon and someone asks, to whom are you referring? I will answer something like Napoleon was emperor of the French in the early part of the 19th century. He was eventually defeated at Waterloo, thus giving a uniquely identifying description to determine the referent of the name. Frege and Russell then appear to give the natural account of how reference is determined here. Mill appears to give none. There are subsidiary arguments which, though they are based on more specialized problems, are also motivations for accepting this view. One is that sometimes we may discover that two names have the same referent and express this by an identity statement. So, for example, I guess this is hackneyed example. This is a hackneyed example. You see a star in the evening, and it's called Hesperus. That's what we call it in the evening. Is that right? I hope it's not the other way around. We see a star in the morning and call it Phosphorus. Well then, in fact, we find that it's not a star, but the planet Venus, and Hesperus and Phosphorus are in fact the same. So we express the morning star is the evening star. This by Hesperus is phosphorus. Here we're certainly not saying of an object that it's identical with itself. This is something that we discovered. A very natural thing to say is that the real content is that the star which we saw in the evening is the star which we saw in the morning. Or more accurately, that the thing which we saw in the morning is the thing we saw in the evening. We saw in the evening is the thing we saw in the morning. This then gives the real meaning of the identity statement in question. And the analysis in terms of descriptions does this. Also, we may raise the question whether a name has reference at all when we ask, for instance, whether Aristotle ever existed. It seems natural here to think that what is questioned is not whether this thing, man, existed. Once we've got the thing, we know that it existed. What really is queried is whether anything answers to the properties we associate with the name. In the case of Aristotle, whether any one Greek philosopher produced certain works, or at least a suitable number of them. It would be nice to answer all of these arguments. I'm not entirely able to see my way clear through every problem of this sort that can be raised. Furthermore, I am pretty sure that I won't have time to discuss all these problems in these lectures. Nevertheless, I think it's pretty certain that the view of Frege and Russell is false. Many people have said that the theory of Frege and Russell is false, but in my opinion, they have abandoned its letter while retaining its spirit. Namely, they have used the notion of a cluster concept. Well, what is this? The obvious problem for Frege and Russell, the one which comes immediately to mind, is always mentioned by Frege himself. He said, quote, "In the case of genuinely proper names like Aristotle, opinions as regards their sense may diverge. As such may, for instance, be suggested, Plato's disciple and the teacher of Alexander the Great. Whoever accepts this sense will interpret the meaning of the statement, Aristotle was born in Stagira, differently from one who interpreted the sense of Aristotle as the Stagirite teacher of Alexander the Great. As long as the nominatum remains this or nominatum remains the same, these fluctuations in the sense are tolerable, but they should be avoided in the system of a demonstrative science and should not appear in a perfect language." So according to Frege, there is some sort of looseness or weakness in our language. Some people might give one sense to the name Aristotle, others may give another. But of course, it is not only that. Even a single speaker, when asked, "What description are you willing to substitute for the name?" he'll be quite at a loss. In fact, he may know many things about him, but any particular thing that you know, sorry, but any particular thing that he knows may feel clearly expresses a contingent property of the object. If Aristotle meant the man who taught Alexander the Great, and saying Aristotle was a teacher of Alexander the Great would be a mere tautology, but surely it isn't. It expresses the fact that Aristotle taught Alexander the Great something we could discover to be false. So being the teacher of Alexander the Great cannot be part of the sense of the name. The most common way out of this difficulty is to say, really, is it not a weakness in ordinary language that we can't substitute a particular description for the name? That's all right. What we really associate with the name is a family of descriptions. A good example of this is, if I can find it, in Philosophical Investigations, where the idea of family resemblances is introduced with great power. Consider this example. If one says Moses did not exist, this may mean various things. It may mean the Israelites did not have a single leader when they withdrew from Egypt, or the leader was not called Moses, or there cannot have been anyone who accomplished all that the Bible relates to Moses. When I make a statement about Moses, am I always ready to substitute some one of those descriptions for Moses? I shall perhaps say, by Moses, I understand the man who did what the Bible relates to Moses, or at any rate, a good deal of it. But how much? Have I decided how much must be proved false for me to give up my proposition as false? Has the name Moses got a fixed and unequivocal use for me in all possible cases? According to this view, and a locus classicus of his Searle's article on proper names, the referent is determined not by a single description, but by some cluster of family. Whatever in some sense satisfies enough or most of the family is the referent of the name. I shall return to this view later. It may seem, as an analysis of ordinary language, quite a bit more plausible than that of Frege and Russell. It may seem to keep all the virtues and remove the defects of this theory. Let me say, and this will introduce us to another new topic before I really consider this theory of naming, that there are two ways in which the cluster concept theory, or even the theory which requires a single description, can be viewed. One way of regarding it says that the cluster or the single description actually gives the meaning of the name. And when someone says Walter Scott, he means the man such that such and such and such. Now another view might be that even though the description in some sense doesn't give the meaning of the name, it is what determines its reference. And although the phrase Walter Scott isn't synonymous with the man such and such that such and such and such and such, or even maybe with the family, if something can be synonymous with the family or the single description is what is used to determine to whom someone is referring when he says Walter Scott. Of course, if when we hear his beliefs about Walter Scott, we find that they're actually much more nearly true of Salvador Dali, and accordingly, this theory of reference of this name is going to be Mr. Dali, not Scott. There are writers, I think, who explicitly deny that names have meanings at all, even more strongly than I would, but still use this picture of how the referent of the name gets determined. A good case in point is Paul Zif, who says very emphatically that names don't have meaning at all, and they're not a part of language in some sense. But still, when he talks about how we determine what the reference of the name is, then he gives this picture. Unfortunately, I don't have the passage in question with me. This is what he says. Quote, okay, it's a footnote. The difference between using this theory as a theory of meaning and using it as a theory of reference will come out a little more clearly later on. But some of the attractiveness of this theory is lost if it isn't supposed to give the meaning of the name. For some of the solutions of problems that I've just mentioned will not be right, or at least won't clearly be right, if the description doesn't give the meaning of the name. For example, if someone said Aristotle does not exist, means there is no man doing such and such, or an example from Wittgenstein, Moses does not exist, means no man did such and such, that might depend, and in fact I think does depend, on taking the theory in question as a theory of the meaning of the name Moses, not just a theory of its reference. Well, I don't know. Perhaps all that is immediate now is the other way around. If Moses says the same as, if Moses means the same as the man who did such and such, and to say that Moses did not exist is to say that the man who did such and such did not exist. That is, that no one person did such and such. If, on the other hand, Moses is not synonymous with any description, then even if its reference is in some sense determined by a description, statements containing the name cannot be analyzed by replacing the name by description, though they may be materially equivalent to statements containing a description. So the analysis of singular existence statements mentioned above will have to be given up unless it is established by some spatial arrangement independent of a general theory of the meaning of names. And the same applies to identity statements. In any case, I think it's false that Moses exists means that at all. So we won't have to see if such a special argument can be drawn up. Before I go any further into this problem, I want to talk about another distinction which will be important in the methodology of these talks. Philosophers have talked, and of course, has been considerable controversy in recent years over the meaningfulness of these notions, about various categories of truth which are called a priori, analytic, necessary, and sometimes even certain is thrown into this batch. The terms are often used in as if whether there are two things answering to those concepts. Now, an interesting question, which we might as well regard them all as meaning the same thing. Now, everyone remembers Kant a bit as making a distinction between. So maybe this distinction is still made. In contemporary discussion, very few people, if any, distinguish between the concept of statements being a and their being necessary. At any rate, I shall not use the terms a priori and necessary interchangeably here. Consider what the traditional characterizations of such terms as a priori and necessary are. First, the notion of prioricity is a concept of epistemology. I guess the tradition of I guess the tra- oh my god I guess the traditional characterization from Kant goes something like a priori truths are those which can be known independently of any experience. This introduces another problem before we get off the ground because there's another modality in the characterization of a priori, namely, it is supposed to be something which can be known independently of any experience. That means that, in some sense, it's possible, whether we do or do not, in fact, know it independently of any experience, to know this independently of any experience. And possible for whom? For God, for the Martians, or just for people with minds like ours? To make this all clear might involve a host of problems, all of its own, about what sort of possibility is in question here. It might be best, therefore, instead to use the phrase a priori truth to the extent that one uses it at all to stick to the question of whether a particular person or knower knows something a priori or believes it true on the basis of a priori evidence. I won't go further too much into the problems that might arise with the notion of a prioricity here. I will say that some philosophers somehow changed the modality in these characterizations from can to must. They think that if something belongs to the realm of a priori knowledge, it couldn't possibly be known empirically. This is just a mistake. Uh, it's not exclusive to, it could be known empirically. Something may belong in the realm of such statements and can be known a priori, but still may be known by particular people on the basis of experience. Okay. To give a really common sense example, anyone who has worked with a computing machine knows that the computing machine may give an answer to whether such and such a number is prime. No one has calculated or proved that the number is prime, but the machine has given the answer. This number is prime. We then, if we believe that the number is prime, believe it on the basis of our knowledge of the laws of physics, the construction of the machine, and so on. We therefore do not believe this on the basis purely a priori evidence. We believe it, if anything, a posteriori at all, on the basis of a posteriori evidence. Nevertheless, maybe this could be known a priori by someone who made the requisite calculations. So can be known a priori doesn't mean must be known a priori. The second concept which is in question is that of necessity. Sometimes it is used in an epistemological way and might just mean a priori. And of course, sometimes it is used in a physical way when people distinguish between physical and logical necessity. But what I'm concerned with here is a notion which is not a notion of epistemology but of metaphysics, in some, I hope, non-pejorative sense. We ask whether something might have been true, might have been false. Well, if something is false, then it's obviously not necessarily true. If it is true, might it have been otherwise? It is possible that, in this respect, the world should have been different from the way it is. Is it possible that is it possible that, in this respect, the world should have been different from the way it is? If the answer is no, then this fact about the world is a necessary one. If the answer is yes, then this fact about the world is a contingent one. This in and of itself has nothing to do with anyone's knowledge of anything. It's certainly a philosophical thesis and not a matter of obvious definitional equivalence, either that everything a priori is necessary or that everything necessary is a priori. Both concepts may be vague. This may be another problem. But at any rate, they are dealing with two different domains, two areas, the epistemological and the metaphysical. Consider, say, Fermat's theorem or the Goldbach conjecture. Goldbach conjecture says that even a prime number greater than 2 must be the sum of two prime numbers. If this is true, it is presumably necessary. If it is false, presumably necessarily false. We are taking the classical view of mathematics here and assume that in mathematical reality is either true or false. If the Goldbach conjecture is false, then there is an even number n greater than 2, such that for no primes p1 and p2, both less than n, does n equal to p1 and p2 plus p2. This fact about n, if true, is verifiable by direct computation, and thus is necessary if the results of arithmetical computations are necessary. On the other hand, if the conjecture is true, then even number. On the other hand, if the conjecture is true, then every even number exceeding 2 is the sum of two primes. Could it then be the case that although in fact every such even number is the sum of two primes, there might have been such an even number which was not the sum of two primes? What would that mean? Such a number would have to be one of 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on. And by hypothesis, since we are assuming Goldbach's conjecture to be true, each of these can be shown, again, by direct computation to be the sum of two primes. Goldbach's conjecture, then, cannot be contingently true or false. Whatever truth value it has belongs to it by necessity. I'll end there.